So in my last video, I took you to the spectacular coastal region of northeast Scotland. The water was glittering and I was so inspired to paint. But with that came a lot of challenges, which I eventually overcame and did my best to make a painting. But if you want to watch that whole process, go check out that video first. In this video, I'm going to take you back to my studio, talk about what I learned on location, and do a new painting, trying to correct some of the things that I felt I got wrong, but also expand upon what I learned. I've done a few of these lessons learned videos, so I'll put a link in the description if you want to check those out. I started by doing a quick sketch, and this is going to be covered up by gouache, obviously, but it just helps me kind of have a game plan, and I especially wanted to make sure that I mostly stuck to my original composition. I did alter it just a tiny bit in terms of like what kind of rocks I did in the foreground, I think, but it was pretty close. And one of the biggest changes I did straight away is that instead of doing sort of a value study with the pinkish tone, I did a full wash over the entire sheet of paper. And I've had quite a lot of people ask me about the whole underpainting thing. Basically, the whole point is to get rid of the white of the paper because the white of the paper is extremely distracting from what you see in life. If you start with a more mid-tone value or some kind of color on your paper, you can then build up to your brights and go down to your shadows. So let's take a look at the original painting I did outside. I'm going to be altering different things within the painting. For the sky, I want to go with more of a soft texture. I like the colors overall, and the value I thought was okay, but I want it to be a little bit less distracting. And in the water, I don't want quite so much pink to show through. I want to go with a little bit more of a bold blue because that's what I saw in person. In the rocks, I'm going to try to capture the brighter parts of the rocks, which I didn't quite do in my plein air painting. I also really want to improve on the distant cliffs and how they seem to recede in the distance, which I don't think I did very good. I want to play with the colors and the values in those. So there's a lot to do. Let's get started. Someone asked me if I use references when I'm back in the studio, and yes, absolutely. My plein air painting is sitting right in front of me, and to the left I have my iPad full of reference images, so I use both of those to help inform my decisions. To start off, I'm going to lay in my sky color, and this time instead of using bigger, bold, chunky brush strokes. I mean, I am doing that a little bit, but I want to capture like a softer feel in the sky this time. So I'm diluting the paint a little bit and I'm sweeping the color on in longer, softer brush strokes. And while that's wet, I can touch in some of the sky color. I start off with a pale blue, but as you can see, I'm painting on top of pink, so it kind of becomes like a really, really light, dull lavender. And then I continue to add more and more blue. I'm letting just hints of that pink show through for some of the shadowy parts of my clouds. But for the highlights, I'm using almost pure white, and I'm just letting it softly blend in with what I already put down. My goal with this painting is to capture the summery colors that I saw, but also imbue a sense of that joy and that freedom I felt while I was there. I was a little overwhelmed, as you saw in the first video, but I was also so ecstatic. It was absolutely beautiful, and it was just the quintessential summer day. So I want to kind of capture that feeling. Therefore, I'm going to be using a slightly more fantasy style color palette. So not purely based on what I saw in nature. It's going to have a bit of a twist to it. And again, that's where the underpainting comes into play. I'm letting that pink show through, which obviously you wouldn't see in real life. It's just an artistic choice that I make that I personally enjoy. So one of my bigger lessons of the first painting was that I struggled to get the depth in the cliffs as they receded into the distance. I was struggling with color mixing and which values to use. If you watched that first video, you saw that I had to paint over the background cliffs a couple times because I just wasn't paying close enough attention. I was just kind of rushing through the whole process, and, because the light was changing constantly, I was really second guessing a lot of my choices. So this time I went into it with a game plan. I knew I wanted those distant cliffs to be a little bit less saturated, a little more pastel, but also leaning more towards the cooler side of things. And just for fun, I decided to use a lavender tone. You may notice in a lot of my forest paintings that I really like combining purple and green. And I guess that's sort of bleeding into my other subjects. But for this instance, it worked really well because there was lots of grass growing on the tops of the cliffs. So obviously I wanted to have some kind of green. But again, because it's off way in the distance, I want to reduce the saturation and then make sure I don't go too dark or too light, because then it will be really distracting. And this was also sort of an experiment because obviously gouache dries slightly different. Like it either dries lighter or darker. So I had to put the color down and then wait and see how it dried. Because I was going for such low contrast, I had to make sure that it actually worked before I finalized it. So it took a lot of patience, and that's something I lack when I'm outside. So again, doing this in the studio, it allowed me to experiment a little bit more and really pay attention to those subtle shifts. Another thing that I struggled with was trying to create a natural shift between the distant cliff, the middle one, and the foreground. I felt like they looked a little bit disjointed in my original plein air painting. So this time I was going to be using color, but also trying not to make it too much of a jump. And I think I especially struggle with that in gouache because the colors will dry darker or lighter. So again, you have to put it down, see how it dries, and then see if you made the right choice or adjust it. And sometimes I think I'm only altering my color just a tiny bit, but it becomes a drastic difference. So in the plein air painting, if you look closely at the grass that is on top of the cliffs, there isn't really enough variation in the color or value. So the distant cliff, the farthest one away, and the middle one have a bit of variation, but then from that middle one to the foreground, they're basically the same color and value. So I knew in my new painting, I needed to definitely pay attention to that, like use a bit more color, a bit more saturation in the foreground cliff so that it stands out from the middle cliff. And once again, I would add a bit more white to my mixes in the middle ground. So until I get to the foreground, I'm trying to keep my colors just a little bit more muted, and adding white or black is the fastest way to do that. I also felt that the middle cliff in my plein air painting was a bit too dark and didn't have enough highlight. So the darks were too dark and there was not enough highlight on the rocks. So this time I went with a slightly lighter dark and then came back in and added my brighter highlights. So I mentioned earlier that the water was something I wanted to improve upon. And even though I liked the water in my plein air painting, I didn't feel that it captured the real sense of depth that the ocean had when I was there. So this time I decided to go much more bold with the water just to see what would happen. So I started off with lots and lots of ultramarine, and then as I got closer and closer to the foreground, I started adding in the cobalt teal light, which is this brilliant turquoise color. And I just kind of shifted back and forth between those in order to build up the depth there, but especially letting a lot of that turquoise show through in the foreground. I watered down the paint just a little to get it to flow nicely, and because my paper is tilted up at a 45-degree angle, the gravity helps pull the paint down towards me, which is really useful. And I mimicked the direction of the waves with my brush strokes. So as they come closer and start to go towards the beach, they are curving slightly so that I could capture the sense of waves and the movement there. Starting with a really intensely saturated base color of water, I think is more useful because then I can always come back and blend in some slightly desaturated blue or like add the sparkles on the water and detract from that a little bit. It just helps to have that base down before I move on to the next layers. For most of the shadows in the water, I'm using an ultramarine, so it's almost pure ultramarine with very little water mixed in, kind of a dry brush technique, just sweeping over the distant ocean area. And in the foreground, I do a little bit of that ultramarine shadow under the rocks, which I didn't do at all in the plein air painting, and I kind of felt like it was lacking that. When I looked at my reference photos, I noticed that anytime the rocks would plunge down below the water, those areas were really dark blue. So in my painting, I chose ultramarine to represent that. So as I said, I wanted to use a slightly fantastical color palette to really emphasize that summer feeling. So in the base of my foreground rocks, I went with a rather vibrant brown magenta mix and then slowly built up the textures and different colors and values on top of that. And by now in the painting, I was feeling much better, much more confident in my choices. So in that sense, I gave myself permission to play. Instead of just like rushing to figure out what I was doing, I was really exploring different ideas. That's something I really love about doing a painting again back in the studio. For my deep, dark colors, especially in this cave area, I went with a mix of my quinacridone magenta, my ultramarine, and my burnt umber, because that is a really rich, dark, it's not quite black, but it's basically the black in my painting. I used it a little bit here and there for some of the deeper cracks, but mostly just stuck with it at the cave area. And another thing I noticed when looking at my reference photos, something I didn't even think about when I was out painting, is that there's actually quite a big shadow being cast down on the cliffs. So I decided to use a purplish color to represent that. So I started with a base of that shadow, and then I knew I could always come back and lighten it or change it up if I needed to. And this is kind of a perfect example of how I take my artistic license and run with an idea. So no, I'm not necessarily seeing this exact scene, this composition or the colors in person, or even from my reference photos, but I'm using this feeling that I have within me and trying to let that inspire my choices as well. It's kind of a combination of using what I learned outside, my reference photos, and my imagination. And it does take time to build up that skill because I think it really is its own skill. But again, just repetition, trying to do this over and over again, and eventually you figure out a formula that kind of works for you. Anyways, back to the painting. So for the base color of a lot of the rocks this time, I went with like a peachy tone because, again, I thought I didn't capture the feeling of brightness on the rocks in my original painting. I felt like I made them a bit too dull and the sun was really beating down on those rocks. And I noticed that when I compared the saturation of the highlight on the rocks where it was direct sun, it was much more white than it was warm or cool. So I added white just to see what that effect would do, and I felt like it was much more successful. And obviously I didn't leave it just pure white. I was blending in colors as I went. But in order to figure out how I should finish those rocks, I needed to finish the grass on top because I knew I wanted that to be really bold. I wanted it to stand out from the background and bring this cliff forward. So I started with a pretty bold green and then I let that dry. Doing that foreground grass made me realize that I wanted to add a bit more variation in the distant ones as well. So I went back in and touched in some olivey green to kind of break up that whitish green that I had back there. I was liking how the rock color was drying, so I continued that. I added a bit more of the purple, but as I got away from the really shadowy area, I would lighten it up a bit more. And then I would blend it into some of the warm colors. And I also realized in the original painting, I never really paid attention to adding shadow beneath the overhanging foliage, so this time I made sure to do that. I am a little bit more patient in the studio, but I'm not a saint. So I was getting too excited to paint more details on the water, and I went in with some pure tiny white brush strokes right by the rocks to capture the feeling of the waves crashing and flowing around those rocks. Of course, I was using dry brush technique because it's the perfect way to mimic the feeling of that frothy wave action. And as I'm doing that, I'm thinking about my other areas in the painting that I want to improve upon. So I noticed quite early on that I wanted to do another layer in the distant mountain, in the distant cliff, but I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. And based on my experience painting it the first time, I knew I didn't want to just sweep color over the whole thing. So I decided to go in with shadowy cracks and crevices and kind of vary some of the values that I was painting there, but do it in a very subtle way because I still wanted that cliff to be really faded off in the distance. I don't know if you remember from the first video, I mentioned that it was kind of hazy that day. And even though the haze would come and go, one thing that really stands out in my memory is that the distant cliffs were often slightly shrouded with that haze. But I loved that because it made the foreground pop out even more. I also felt that the foreground of the water needed a bit more variation, so I decided to come back in with a few strokes of a deeper blue, basically just using that ultramarine and letting the brush naturally dry out so that it blended with the existing gouache. I liked the sense of action and drama I created in my plein air painting for the waves, so I wanted to bring a little bit of that back in, and using the quick horizontal brushstrokes helped me do that. But it wasn't enough for me. I wanted to add kind of a glittered effect to the surface of the water, so I decided to splash it with a bunch of pure white paint. Ah, that's better. Okay, so my final touches on the painting were to add a bit more variation in the foreground foliage, like up above the rocks, all of that grassy area. There's lots of gorse, there's lots of different plants growing up there, so I just went with it. I just had fun with color and then came back in and sort of blended it a little bit more. I also wanted to add a bit more variation in the texture on the rocks and add some cracks and just kind of clean that up a bit. And as I was doing that, I noticed on the right side where there's lots of shadow, it just looked a little bit messy. So I decided to come back in and smooth out some of those shadows and brighten the left side of those rocks just a little bit so they stood out more. And finally, just a bit more shadow underneath the plants. And just a heads up, over on my Patreon in July, I will be sharing a bunch of reference photos from this trip as well as doing some tutorials of this subject. So if you're interested in that, go check out the link in the description. And finally, let's compare the results. So I have to say my experience of painting was much more pleasurable in the studio this time, but I liked each painting for their own reasons. I know I learn a lot when I go out and paint, and I just want to encourage you guys that if you're intimidated to do it, I totally understand, but there's nothing like painting from life. You learn so much about color, you learn so much about what you're actually painting, so I highly encourage you. And I hope this video inspires you to continue your efforts, even if it's difficult. I think it's easy to look at social media and think, oh, I'm so behind these artists, I'll never get to that point. But you know what? It just takes one painting at a time to get there. So go out and have fun. I hope you enjoyed this. Of course, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed but want to see more content, make sure you hit that button before you go. All right, everybody, take care. I will see you again soon.